storm. Tragically, 44 people lost their lives, and many of them perished in their cars when they were unable to open their garage doors, or in their swimming pools when they were trying to take refuge from the heat and flames. So this is something that hits very close to home and is very personal for all of us. Our children have been impacted too, and many Sonoma County children wake up from nightmares in the middle of the night thinking that the fire is going to come and get them. So we are also looking at issues of, quite frankly, generational trauma caused by these repeat wildfire disasters. And for our children, summers are no longer carefree. It's fire season, it's smoke season. Our children know how to look at air quality monitors and sort of find out whether or not they can go outside to play in the morning. They know what it's like to be under a red flag warning. They know what it's like to evacuate from their homes and gather up their belongings and their go bag to go someplace where it's safe when a wildfire is in the area. I'm not convinced that you can fully understand the apocalyptic impacts of climate change until you've lived through it. You can learn in school that aluminum melts at 660 degrees Celsius, and yet it's something entirely different to go into a neighborhood that has just been reduced to ash and rubble and see what an aluminum melted hubcap looks like when it runs down a driveway in this sort of little silver stream. These are the kinds of images that are sort of ingrained forever, quite frankly, in the minds of Sonoma County residents. Next slide, please. And wildfire is an increasing problem, not only for Sonoma County, but really for the entire state of California. It's already been said, but I feel like at every panel, we always have to mention, if we're from California, that we are the 5th largest economy in the world, home to nearly 40 million people. And we are now increasingly a state that is one of those communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. Of our 20 largest fires on record, all but 3 of them occurred within the last 2 decades. 10 of them came in 2018 or later, and 4 of the top 20 wildfires happened just this year. So it's very clear that this is a problem that is not going away, and this is not an anomaly. This is a pattern that is growing increasingly severe over time. Next slide, please. One of the things that's really important to grapple with, since we are an air district board, is the health impacts of these wildfires. Quite frankly, this is happening so rapidly that we don't even have the data to demonstrate what these kinds of severe particulate matter impacts are and how they might differ from an area where I live, which is not next to a refinery, right? Compared to communities, particularly those disadvantaged communities and communities of color who are already impacted by degraded air quality as a result of the industry that occurs within their neighborhoods. So if you look at this graph here, where we want to be is actually sort of in that yellow range, right? Sort of the green or the yellow. That's below 35 micrograms per square meter. And you can see that as a result of our wildfires, we are literally off the charts for our air quality in the Bay Area. And if you look at those images, those are the images that we wake up and see all day. In the Bay Area, there were sort of these days where it felt like the sun never rose, and we were looking at sort of the world through this absolutely apocalyptic orange haze, which again, in addition to the potential health impacts, also has an impact on the mental health of our communities. Next slide, please. But I promised that I would not be all doom and gloom, and we are trying to, in some ways, use the opportunity, which is a strange word to use when it comes to wildfires, but the opportunity to rebuild, to build back better. So rather than sort of build the same kind of buildings that are reliant upon greenhouse gas emitting infrastructure, we are actually trying to utilize the best available technology to convert those houses into all electric. While we don't have all electric mandates in all of the areas that experience the wildfires, we do have an opportunity to create incentives. And so that is actually what we are doing. And as I mentioned before, we have a number of different agencies who are engaged in this work. And so we're actually working to create layered incentives with respect to rebuilding our infrastructure. So a few of the sort of different general programs that we have, we have a chipping pilot program to try to reduce burning. So this is again aimed at sort of lowering our overall particulate matter content. We are also working on reducing our fire hazards, which actually can sometimes mean prescribed burning in areas that might otherwise cause sort of a more catastrophic conflagration. So we actually, even though we're trying to disincentivize maybe unnecessary burning, right, like agricultural products, we also want to look at our wildlands as an area that needs to be managed. In addition to that, we are also really focusing on clean air centers, which is, I think, something that maybe 10 years ago would have been completely anathema. But we are literally working to create places that people can go during periods of exceptionally poor air quality. So, think of it like a cooling center during a heat wave. This would be a place where we have plenty of air purifiers, where residents who might not have their own air purifiers at home can go and spend the day in order to be able to breathe clean air. More importantly, I think that we are also working on a home air filtration program. I'm very fortunate, right? I don't have to worry about whether or not I can afford an air purifier to make sure that my kids have clean air when they're sleeping in their bedroom overnight. I also don't have to worry about the cost of running that air purifier and whether I am able to sort of, afford the electric bill that might come as a result of running those air purifiers 24/7. But many of our disadvantaged community members in Sonoma County and throughout the Bay Area might have to make that choice. Do I buy the air purifier, or do I make sure that my family has enough groceries for the month? And so we are trying to actually step up and support those socioeconomically disadvantaged communities to try to make sure that they have access to air purifiers in their own home. Next slide, please. Now, this gets at a little bit of that Build Back Better program that I was describing, where we are actually trying to make sure that we aren't just kind of repeating, quite frankly, the same mistakes of the past. I think it would be a huge shame if all of the homes that were lost were rebuilt in ways that actually further exacerbate the climate crisis. Next slide, please. So this actually shows you the nuts and bolts of how that sort of incentive program works. So if you notice, we've got $7,500 for energy efficiency, electric ready, indoor solar ready, and EV charger installed packages, right? And actually now in Sonoma County, we recently opened up our advanced energy center through Sonoma Clean Power. So folks who are in the process of rebuilding their homes can actually go and get an example of what an induction cooktop looks like, right? Oh, and next slide, I think I'm one ahead. This is what I'm talking about right now. Just waiting for the next slide. There we go, perfect. So this kind of explains how the incentive structure works. And the incentive structure actually goes up to $12,500 for sort of an all electric home rebuild. And then we also are struggling right now in the Bay Area with what's known as public safety power shutoffs. These are instances where we are experiencing severe wildfire weather and where our electric utility will actually turn off the power in order to prevent those electrical lines from starting a fire that could then threaten to burn down homes. So in addition to dealing with the impacts of wildfire, we are also experiencing the impacts of mass sudden power outages. And this is where the battery storage comes in, and where we have to recognize that while all electric is our goal with respect to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we also do need to have backup plans for when that power goes out. And when you create sort of a plan, sometimes that involves, you've got your solar, you have an electric car, right? You have an all electric home, and then you actually have a battery backup so that when the power is off, you still have an ability to power your home, which is particularly important actually for some of our vulnerable and elderly community members who might be reliant, say, on durable medical equipment for health needs. So this is actually a really exciting program and an exciting package that we are working on. Next slide, please. I also want to mention, that this is sort of an effort that goes beyond the Bay Area. And so, you're actually seeing these sorts of programs start to spread statewide and really throughout the Western United States. So this is an example actually after the Thomas Fire, which was in Southern California, sort of between Ventura and Santa Barbara, where the U.S. Green Building Council actually came to provide hands-on workshops and one-on-one consultations with lead experts to try to support those homeowners who had lost their home in rebuilding back better and trying to make sure that we are actually investing in the infrastructure of the future instead of really sort of rebuilding the infrastructure of the past. Next slide, please. And I will say that the state of California has taken an absolute lead role in resiliency initiatives. As I said before, this is a statewide problem, and it is one we are forced to grapple with each and every year. So we're actually working on aligning, again, those sort of different resources. We also have FEMA, which comes in from the federal government after a wildfire. And so we're trying to essentially create programs wherein our national, our state, and our various local agencies are all rowing in the same direction in order to accomplish this idea of building back better from our wildfires. Next slide, please. One thing that I want to mention before I wrap up here is that while all of these programs are really exciting, they are mostly geared at homeowners. And what we are starting to see is the repeat of of disasters in Sonoma County are actually really deepening the socioeconomic disparities that unfortunately have existed in our communities for, quite frankly, centuries, often along racial lines. And so we also need to figure out, how do we assist our tenants? How do we assist our renters who wind up displaced from the fire? How do we assist our employees who were out of work for a week and suddenly find themselves behind on rent or on their utility bills? While I think we are getting at that infrastructure piece, which is really, really critical, we're not really getting at the social infrastructure piece. And so I am concerned, since we're talking about climate action with an equity lens, that we need to be having robust conversations in California, but really throughout the United States, regarding things like universal health care, paid family leave, disaster leave, the sorts of systems that can pick folks up when they're in the midst of a disaster. And so while I'm proud of the work that we have done, I think that we need to do even more, quite frankly, to reach those socioeconomically disadvantaged communities, because they are the ones who are on the front lines of the climate crisis and really often don't have as many resources available to them as they sort of rebuild their lives. Even if they don't own their home, everyone after a disaster has to pick up and rebuild their lives. And I hope that we can continue to work on the tools to that. So with that, I will sort of hand it back to you, Abby. And yeah, looking forward to the conversation continuing.
Great. Thank you so much, Lynda. It's fascinating to hear about and horrible to hear about the experiences, but then also inspirational to hear what you're all doing now in Sonoma County. And we're going to go back to John Bauters. And if you're just joining us, John is a city council member from the city of Emeryville in the Bay Area, and he's, like Lynda, a member of the board of our of the Air District Board of Directors. And handing it back over to John.
Thanks, Abby, and thank you, Lynda, for getting us started in the conversation about what are we doing? Are we doing enough to financially assist the most socioeconomically disadvantaged community members? And it's not just wildfires that are a source of that problem. There are things that we do proactively as part of our climate strategy, right? So building decarbonization. If you could go 2 slides. Yeah, building decarbonization. So one of the fascinating things about being here at COP26 is you get to see kind of where around the world everybody is at taking on these important issues. And in the Bay Area, we're really fortunate. We benefit from a couple structural leadership elements about how the air district regulation process works that are allowing us to do some really front end, kind of what's the way I want to put this? We're really cutting edge when it comes to trying to lead in reducing carbon emissions. And so in the Bay Area, buildings represent about 13% of our carbon dioxide emissions. And so they're a source of emissions and pollution in the air that is really within reach for us to individualize to homeowners and tenants and say, this is something that we can do together to make our air cleaner. Yet it's a lot more complicated than you might think to do that. And we benefit from a couple things. Structurally in California, most nations who are here are represented at a national level with an environmental air quality management system. And in the United States, we have not just CARB at the state, but then we have the regional air districts that Abby talked about, the 35 in California. And then we have local cities and governments like Lynda's and mine that can do our own things. And in the Bay Area, we've actually at an energy level, we've moved in a lot of ways from fossil fuel-based electricity to renewable energies. So a lot of the electricity in the Bay Area is being derived from wind and hydropower and solar, which gives us an opportunity to actually make an entire mode shift away from natural gas in the home, as we talked about a little bit already, to an electric-based infrastructure in homes. And so building decarbonization becomes one way in which we as a region can significantly reduce emissions, but the big issue is how do you do that equitably? Next slide, please. So as I just mentioned, there's 51 cities in California, 42 of them are located in our 9-county region, which have adopted policies that will ban or limit natural gas in new construction. Under the California State Building Code, we have authority as local governments to do something called REACH codes, which are essentially the opportunity to go beyond the state building code as it relates to certain types of infrastructure elements or requirements or design to allow local governments to do this. And so many cities have seen the state's climate goals, the action steps that have been requested of local governments to help achieve net emissions reductions, and they're motivated by that. They're motivated by the climate emergency. They see the kinds of things we just heard from Lynda talk about right in their backyard, literally. And so responding to the public demand to make our communities more sustainable and resilient and clean, many Bay Area cities have and counties have taken the initiative to adopt REACH codes and begin their own process of accelerating things that we're trying to do at a regional level. We are essentially incentivizing and promoting them to take that on even faster as they can. And so that's something happening right now. Next slide, please. But then you reach the reality of what does it cost to decarbonize a home? And this is where you kind of start to begin to encounter some of the legacy issues that we talked about at the very beginning of this presentation about how socioeconomic status in the United States in particular is largely derived from historic racial inequities, and environmental justice issues continue to follow that to this day. So here you have a simple example of what it's like to build natural gas out of an infrastructure, to make a conversion as opposed to a new construction item. And you see up there a number of different costs, right? So you have everything from piping in and out conduit, you have in-home improvements, and then you have technology components that need to be changed on apparatuses to do something as simple as a water heater or a furnace. That's really kind of the scope of what we're talking about right now. It's a handful of home appliances that are the largest contributors to carbon emissions in the home and in the community. But when you do a rough estimate total, you can get very quickly to $7,000 in improvements for a home. Now, that is out of reach to most Americans. In fact, in the United States, about 40% of Americans could not afford a one-time $500 emergency today if it faced them. That's a very unsettling fact. So when you think about, well, we want to try to promote and incentivize, and we have elected leadership and state leadership and climate incentives for us to move forward towards building decarbonization quickly, the reality you run into is, well, how do we help make it affordable for people to do this in a way that makes them embrace being part of climate change innovation? So for every $1,000 of increase in a home's price, roughly about 10,000 people in California become priced out of affording their home. And so when you think about it, that's about 70,000 families that are priced out right there over a simple $7,000 home improvement related to swapping out a natural gas water heater or furnace, for example, and converting to a fully electric appliance that perhaps relies locally based on community energy standards on renewable energies. So essentially turning a home into an almost carbon-free participant in the community. Next slide. And this is going to become an even more difficult problem, because as we begin to actually migrate, our good work actually can yield new challenges. So the cost of gas has been increasing at a far greater rate than the cost of electricity prices. And while that's good, we'll let that. Good morning, there's an announcement. Okay, make sure. I don't know if they can hear that. Make sure you wear your face mask is what I'm being told. Okay, so back on this slide, the cost of electricity isn't increasing at the same rate as gas, but what that means is that once you can switch to electric, it's actually going to become more affordable to you, right? So making the switch to electric is actually an incentive. However, there's that initial hurdle, which is if you can't afford that last slide, making that change, you're actually on an even worse financial trajectory because the cost of gas is going to become more expensive. When there are fewer users of the natural gas system, the cost of maintaining that system continues to remain the same, but becomes more expensive to the smaller number of people using it. So those least able to afford that transition are going to be the ones stuck paying higher and higher gas prices. So who is that going to be? Again, that comes back to communities of color, Black, Indigenous, other communities of color in the Bay Area and across our country who have already been disinvested, who have been redlined historically into neighborhoods that are overburdened. And now, as we try to make this energy and climate impact change to renewable, sustainable, and resilient design, they're economically disadvantaged to making that change, which means they're going to be left holding the purse for supporting the natural gas system until it goes away. Next slide. So we need to change that. So 43% of Californian households are lower median income and or renters, and they're underserved by the conventional incentive financing programs. So Abby, talked a little bit about how there are some financial incentive programs, but the amount of money that's made through a grant is often not enough money to make the cost completely attainable. And so there are gaps that exist, and even those gaps can be financially out of reach for low-income people. Next slide. So what we do, well, we go straight to the community. We ask the community, what is it that they need? There's no greater, more important question than asking people what they need, what they want, and what they need, rather than surmising or telling people what we think they need. And so when you listen to them, you actually start to identify what is really at the heart of their concern. Is it really, I don't want to make a change to an electric home appliance? Not actually. If you listen to what they're saying and you read some of them up here, I can't afford the upfront costs. What happens when the power goes out? I can't get a loan because of my low credit score. There are a lot of things here that indicate more concern about the financial insecurity and other priorities that people have that are preventing them from making the change. So it's a cost barrier and it's a priorities assessment that people are making of their own needs. Next slide. So the key is in community empowerment program. So when you actually start to talk to people about what it means to build and electrify communities and move away from natural gas and other carbon-based emission sources, what you find is that people want and need other things that, when those needs are met, can help us achieve the climate goals. Housing affordability. The more affordable housing is, the more dispensable income people have, and it makes it possible for them to make these other types of changes. Healthy and safe homes, right? Family safety and family structure is critical. Children's health and welfare is critical. If those things aren't being met at home, moving to from a natural gas furnace to an electric furnace is not a priority. Energy costs. People want to know what they're going to be able to pay every month so they can put food on their table and take care of their families. And addressing climate change impacts. People care about the environment. They want the environment to be clean, but a lot of times people don't actually understand what their own contribution to that environmental footprint is, and helping make the community more knowledgeable in what their own actions can do to yield the changes that they want is actually critical to empowerment. And then local job creation. And part of this conversation, a really bigger chapter of this discussion, needs to be about what's the so-called just transition, and actually helping create jobs in these communities for the people who live here, who've been disinvested, to empower them to build their own communities sustainably. Next slide. And so I think I've got just a couple left here. So the potential financing solutions, right? So we've got the traditional financing options that we've talked about, but a lot of them are not well suited for low and moderate income households. And there are other things that we can do that we are talking to the community in our case about. So there are rebates, other incentives. We're talking with manufacturers, for example, of these appliances about how to incentivize the marketing and the distribution of these appliances, how to partner with the state and state grants programs, ways to take on bill financing. So no interest pays, monthly payment programs that allow people to bill the infrastructure costs into a long-term plan that is more sustainable for them, as opposed to those one-time upfront single expense costs that people often can't afford. And then pay-as-you-save approaches, where people are actually going to start saving money by switching from natural gas to electric. And could the difference in what they are spending as a result of that conversion yield an opportunity, that delta money that becomes available to make payments off of what is owed for the infrastructure costs. But you got to have the community in the room talking about which solutions work, because even in the Bay Area, it's so dynamic and diverse that not every neighborhood or community supports the same programs or ideas, or can actually work with each of them. Next slide. And so letting the community lead is the final lesson for the day, which is that when you allow the community to lead in identifying their own important issues and priorities, and you ask them what they need or want, they'll tell you the things that are going to be most helpful to them. And when you see those things up there in the Bay Area, it's most commonly housing production and tenant protections, equitable access to funding and financing for programs like the ones that we're trying to do, and then a combination of education and outreach. People want to be included in the decisions that impact their lives, and when you reach out to them as a government agency or a public entity to engage them meaningfully in that way, you actually most commonly reach the best solutions. And so, in our case, we actually just passed out of Stationary Source Committee, which is the committee I chair, where we regulate stationary sources like refineries, factories, other large industry sources, but also things like water heaters and furnaces that go into commercial and residential buildings. And we're actually in a process to move to a zero NOx emission standard, which I believe would be the first in the world. So we would actually be requiring at a future date that all newly installed water heaters and furnaces would actually have to have zero NOx emissions, an absolute natural gas-free process. And so that's a very ambitious standard. It's one that we're really excited to work towards, but doing it requires a slightly longer and more thoughtful timeline because it has to include all these community equity components so that we don't leave any of our disadvantaged community members behind when we make that transition. And the sooner communities around the world begin having these types of conversations about how to do this and understanding what the community wants and needs, the sooner we can begin what is often a long road and path towards achieving ultimately our goal of a more sustainable and resilient climate for everyone. And I believe that ends our presentation. So Abby, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
And I'm going to see if we have time, and we're over time.
We started a little late, but we're over time. Do we have time for a question? Yeah, so you want to moderate.
Do you have a question? Okay, great. I'm going to bring my the microphone to you, I think. Yes.
Now that there's not that much, I'll keep it to one then. Keep it to one simple question. Thank you, first of all, for such a wonderful presentation. That was absolutely amazing and so rich and emotional as well. I'm wondering, I do research on cities. Often national governments want to make it seem like all the implementation has to happen in local governments. And sitting at COP26 right now, we have 5 years to go to realize the transition to a zero carbon system. How does that look for you? Because I've listened to your presentation now, and it's so exceedingly complex, the process that you're going through, and seriously taken into account the equity considerations as well. How would you actually implement a transition that is that fast? Who's going to finance it? How are you going to do it? And you present a very united front, but my understanding is that the political system that you're in is actually very complicated. Lynda made several references to this, rowing in the same direction and 10 committees and all of that. So how do you also navigate that within the very complicated multi-level governance systems that you're actually part of?
That's a great question. And one thing that I want to say, first of all, is that in the Bay Area, we're extremely lucky in that it's a very progressive, and I would say mostly unified progressive approach. Everyone understands that climate change needs to be a priority. Not everyone agrees on exactly how to get there, but there is sort of this overwhelming common value and common sense of, I think, political perspective. But I'll be candid. I mean, in local government, some days it feels like we're held together with duct tape and baling twine, and that all we're doing is being hit repeatedly with disasters and trying to recover from that. So in addition to trying to recover from these 7 wildfires, the floods, the drought, the pandemic, then we're also being tasked with, okay, you need to figure out how to get to the future within the next decade. And so I would say that, the ask here, and I've heard this from a lot of local governments, is we do need more resources. We need more capacity. We need to be able to have staff like Abby who focus specifically on this and kind of taking that next step. But I would say the resource issue is huge. And then the resource issue also goes into the community engagement. We need to have people, preferably people who actually come from the communities that they're engaging with, right? Sort of increasing the diversity within government workforce and the representation. And I think that those are kind of the missing pieces that I hope at the sort of the national, international, and state level, they're thinking about how do we resource local government agencies to be able to take this aggressive action that we know we all need. But I'm curious to hear John's answer too.
Well, I have to start by saying duct tape and baling twine. My line has always been rubber bands and fishing wire. So I'm happy to know that there's multiple ways to hold our local governments together. I agree, and I would say there's a, when to your question about how do we all make it work, it is a very complex system. Federalized system is very complex for our country, and we don't agree sometimes between levels of government. We think they don't do enough or they don't prioritize this or that enough ways, and a lot of times the state will pass a regulation or a law that gets sent down to us to, as an agency to put further meat on the bone, and then it comes back to the city and the county to implement it, to your point, right? And it becomes a real challenge for some cities and counties, especially mine is the 100th out of 100 in size. Out of 101 cities in the Bay Area, we're 100th in size. And so I have a 1 square mile city that I represent, and I still have an obligation with entire staffing departments of one. I have one person in my housing department, one person in my environmental services department. How am I supposed to accomplish these climate goals that are passed down to my city and still just do the day-to-day functions of my town, right? And I think that one of the things that we do well, to the financing point, I think one of the things that we do well is we've progressed a lot in structuring financing to leverage all the pieces in the chain. I sometimes wish it didn't feel like you had to put a 500-piece puzzle together to get all the money. That's how it feels sometimes. And the same is true for housing. Like in our city, we passed a housing bond, which we used to leverage the county housing bond, which we used to leverage the state housing bond. So we sold it to our residents in that case as, for every dollar that you'll pay out of the local financing we're going to do, we're going to earn between $3 and $5 of other funding. So in the end, we'll be able to build housing that far exceeds the price you're paying, right? And I think the same can be done and is being done on environmental issues in California, where the state is a national leader, right? And this isn't true. Your question is good because it's not true in other states by any means. But our state really leans in on that and puts money forward for that. And then I think, we levy property taxes as a air district to finance the air district's goals. We apply for grants and we use that to pull the resources we have and we make it available. And, cities and counties that really want to pursue projects like community air centers, things like clean air centers, have a head start to doing it. But it is more complicated when you get to the granular level of residential changes and individual life homes. That's harder. And cities are making, I had a slide up there about cities wanting to pursue this goal of, there's a lot of public support for making this change. It's really hard to tell the public who wants, no more wildfires in their backyard. They don't want to be breathing in, dirty air along the bayshore. They want us to make these changes. They're supporting those changes, but not everybody can move with those changes. So I think that the other component of it is prioritizing the resources we do have for the people who need them the most, and also making the transition in a very deliberate manner. So it'd be real easy to be like, well, anybody who can afford to just go electric, right? And you'll have a whole bunch of people who can financially afford to do it, right? But as I said, then the whole system, the whole natural gas system is now being paid for by the poorest people, right? So it's kind of like when we put incentive money out, we need time to do that and move cohorts of people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. We need the time to move them with everybody else so that the system isn't being funded or financed, the old system, inequitably by the people who've already been bearing the brunt of the environmental burden.
On that note, thank you everyone for joining us in person and online. And we will sign off. And this will be available. Actually, I should say, if anyone out there has any questions, you can send them to climate@BAAQMD.gov, and then we can respond to you. And this recording will be made available in many ways through our individual social media and through the Air District social media as well. So thank you, co-presenters, very much, and have a good rest of the day.
Cheers.
Take care.